I'm not sure what time it was when the screaming started. We'd hiked deep into Blackstone Woods, far from any cell signal, surrounded by endless pines and a carpet of damp moss. It was just me, Jake, and his girlfriend Claire, sitting around the campfire that night. The flames flickered low, throwing distorted shadows onto the surrounding trees, the kind that made you second-guess every branch. Jake had joked earlier about this area being called Dead Man's Hollow, but I figured it was one of his usual attempts to mess with us. Typical Jake. Always the guy who'd wait for you to doze off just to rustle the bushes and scream bloody murder. But when the sound echoed through the forest, a piercing wail that sent chills down my spine, I knew it wasn't him. It didn't sound human. "Did you hear that?" Claire asked, her voice trembling. Jake chuckled, trying to play it off, but his eyes betrayed him. "Probably some animal. Maybe a coyote or something." "Coyotes don't scream like that," I said, my voice firmer than I intended. I felt my heart pick up, thudding louder than the crackling fire. Another scream, this one closer. I froze, gripping my flashlight like it was a weapon. Claire whispered, "Maybe we should just go to bed, guys." But even as she said it, her eyes darted to the shadows, scanning for movement. The thing about Blackstone Woods is, it's the kind of place where the darkness feels alive. No matter how strong your flashlight, the beam just disappears into the black. And that night, the forest felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake stood up, grabbing a branch from the fire like a makeshift torch. "All right, enough of this. I'm gonna check it out." "You're an idiot," I snapped. "You don't just walk toward a sound like that." He smirked, but before he could take another step, we all heard it. A slow, deliberate crunch of leaves coming from behind our tent. Something or someone was watching us. The three of us stood there, frozen. The fire crackled softly, but its light suddenly felt weak, like it was being swallowed by the dark. I don't think any of us even breathed. The sound came again, crunch, crunch, closer this time. It wasn't hurried, like an animal darting through the woods. No, whatever it was taking its time. Claire whispered, "Jake, please don't." But Jake, ever the idiot, turned toward the tent. "Hello? Someone out there?" he called, his voice cracking on the last word. He held the flaming branch higher, but it didn't help much. The shadows shifted, mocking him. "Jake, don't," I hissed. He ignored me, stepping toward the sound. Crunch. I swear I saw movement, just at the edge of the firelight. A dark shape weaving through the trees. It wasn't big, but it wasn't small either. Just wrong. My flashlight beam darted around wildly, but it caught nothing. "Who's there?" Jake yelled, his voice angrier now. Silence. For a moment, it was so quiet I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then laughter. It wasn't loud, and it wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. A soft, wheezing cackle, like someone choking on their own amusement. Claire grabbed my arm so tightly it hurt. "We need to leave," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jake was shaking his head. "It's just some kids screwing with us," he muttered. But I could tell he didn't believe his own words. His knuckles were white around that burning branch. Then the laugh came again, louder, clearer, and this time it wasn't alone. A second laugh joined it, this one deeper, wetter, like the sound of someone gurgling water. I spun my flashlight toward the sound and finally caught something. A flash of movement between the trees. Pale, impossibly pale skin, and were those eyes? Too many of them, glinting in the beam like wet marbles. "Run," I said, my voice cracking. Jake turned to argue, but before he could get a word out, a high-pitched shriek ripped through the woods, so loud it made the fire flicker. Then, all at once, the forest came alive. Branches cracked on all sides. Leaves rustled violently, as if something, or many somethings, were moving through them, circling us. The laughter erupted into a full-blown chorus, echoing from every direction. Jake dropped the branch and bolted. Claire screamed, and before I could stop her, she ran after him, leaving me standing there like a deer in headlights. "Guys, wait!" I yelled, but my voice was swallowed by the chaos. I turned to follow them, but my flashlight flickered and went out. I was alone. The darkness closed in fast, heavy as a suffocating blanket. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot, but my mind was screaming at me to move. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear Claire's voice, shouting Jake's name, but the sound was faint, swallowed up by the forest. And then, there was the laughter again. It was closer now, surrounding me. It wasn't just two voices anymore. It was a chorus. High-pitched, low-pitched, guttural, wheezing, like a crowd of maniacs enjoying some horrible joke I wasn't in on. I fumbled with the flashlight, smacking it against my palm until, miraculously, the beam flickered back to life. It cut through the dark, but I almost wished it hadn't. They were there, shapes crouched low to the ground, too distorted to be human. Their limbs were long and wrong, jointed in ways that made my stomach churn. The pale skin I'd glimpsed earlier glowed faintly in the light, but it wasn't smooth. It was veined, stretched tight over bulging muscles. And their faces, God, their faces. They didn't have eyes where they should be. Instead, they were scattered across their heads, small and black and glistening, darting around wildly like insects. Their mouths were enormous, filled with jagged, mismatched teeth, stretched into grotesque grins. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a root. My flashlight beam jittered across the forest floor, catching glimpses of their movements. Jerky, unnatural, like puppets with tangled strings. And then they started crawling toward me. I turned and ran. Branches whipped at my face. Roots grabbed at my ankles, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. The laughter followed me, growing louder, more frenzied, until it felt like it was right behind me. Jake! Claire! I screamed, my voice cracking. No answer. Just as panic started to choke me, I saw it. The faint glow of a second fire through the trees. My brain barely had time to register relief before I burst into a clearing and nearly collided with Jake. Jesus, man, what the hell is that? He yelled, grabbing my shoulders. I don't know, I gasped, doubling over to catch my breath. Claire was huddled near the fire, clutching a long stick like a spear, her face streaked with tears. They're coming, I said, my voice trembling. Jake's face went pale, and he grabbed the axe we'd used to chop firewood earlier. What do we do? Before I could answer, the forest around us erupted. The creatures poured into the clearing like a tidal wave, their twisted limbs moving too fast for something that size. Their laughter was deafening now, a high-pitched cacophony that made my ears ring. Claire screamed. Jake swung the axe wildly, but the creatures stayed just out of reach, circling us like wolves around their prey. We're not gonna make it, Claire sobbed. Yes, we are, I shouted, though I wasn't sure I believed it. And then I noticed something. The creatures wouldn't come near the fire. Every time one of them lunged forward, it stopped short of the flickering flames, recoiling as if the light burned. They don't like the fire, I yelled. Keep it going. Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed a bundle of branches and tossed them onto the fire, sending sparks shooting into the air. The flames roared higher, and the creatures shrieked, their laughter turning to furious, guttural howls. They backed away, their black eyes glinting with hate, but they didn't leave. They stayed just beyond the firelight, waiting. They're not gonna stop, Claire whispered. Then we don't stop, either, I said, gripping my flashlight like a weapon. The fire roared, casting long, flickering shadows into the forest. The creatures paced just beyond the circle of light, their movements twitchy and predatory. Their grotesque, too-many-eyed faces watched us with a cold, calculated malice. They're waiting for the fire to die, Jake muttered, sweat dripping down his face. We can't stay here, Claire whimpered, her voice shaking. She gripped her makeshift spear so tightly her knuckles turned white. What happens when we run out of wood? I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, trying to think of a way out, but every scenario ended the same. Those things catching us in the dark. The laughter started again, low and guttural, rippling through the trees like a wave. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was a taunt, a promise that they had all the time in the world. Then one of them stepped closer. It was taller than the others, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it moved. The firelight caught its face, revealing rows of jagged, uneven teeth in a grin that stretched impossibly wide. It reached out a long, bony arm, its fingers curling toward us. Jake lunged forward, swinging the axe. "Stay back," he shouted. The creature flinched but didn't retreat. Instead, it tilted its head, as if curious, and then let out a piercing, inhuman scream. The others joined in, their shrieks mingling into a chaotic, deafening roar. And then they rushed us. "Keep them back," I yelled, grabbing a flaming branch from the fire and swinging it wildly. Jake and Claire did the same, brandishing their weapons as the creatures surged forward. The firelight reflected off their glossy eyes, their twisted forms darting in and out of the shadows. One of them lunged at Claire, its claws swiping inches from her face. She screamed and jabbed it with her stick, the sharp point tearing into its pale, veined skin. The creature recoiled with a guttural snarl, but another one immediately took its place. "We can't keep this up," Claire cried. I knew she was right. The fire was already starting to die down, and the woodpile was running dangerously low. "Over there," I shouted, pointing toward a gap in the trees. A faint slope led downward, disappearing into the darkness. "We can make a break for it." Jake glanced at the gap, then back at the fire. "You sure about this?" "No," I admitted, "but it's that or we die here." Claire hesitated, her wide eyes darting between the creatures and the path. "What if they follow us?" "They hate the light," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. "Just run and don't look back." Without waiting for an answer, I threw my flaming branch at the closest creature. It shrieked and stumbled back, giving us just enough time to make a break for it. We ran. The forest closed in around us, the firelight fading behind us as we plunged into the darkness. My flashlight beam danced across the uneven ground, illuminating roots and rocks that threatened to trip us with every step. The laughter followed us. It was everywhere. Above us, behind us, even beneath us, like the forest itself was alive with it. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear the creatures crashing through the undergrowth, their guttural screeches growing closer. "Faster!" I yelled, my lungs burning. The slope grew steeper, and the ground became slick with moss and mud. Claire slipped, crying out as she tumbled to the ground. Jake and I grabbed her arms, pulling her back to her feet as the creatures closed in. "There!" Jake shouted, pointing ahead. Through the trees, I saw it. A narrow creek, its surface shimmering faintly in the moonlight. The sound of rushing water was like music to my ears. We sprinted toward it, splashing into the icy water without hesitation. It was shallow, barely up to our knees, but the cold was a shock to my system. The creatures stopped at the edge of the creek, their black eyes glinting with fury. They hissed and growled, but they didn't step into the water. "They're scared of it," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't know why, and I didn't care. All that mattered was that we had a barrier between us and them. We kept moving, following the creek downstream. The creatures paced along the bank, their grotesque faces watching us, but they didn't follow. Finally, after what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and we stumbled into a clearing. The moonlight illuminated an old dirt road cutting through the woods. Civilization. We collapsed onto the bank, gasping for air. The creatures stayed in the shadows, their laughter fading as we put more distance between us and the forest. None of us said a word. We made it out alive, but I still hear the laughter sometimes. In my dreams, in the quiet of the night, and sometimes, when I'm alone, I swear I see those black eyes watching me from the corner of the room. But I never go camping anymore. A week passed before I finally got the courage to talk about that night. Claire and Jake wouldn't return my calls, which honestly I couldn't blame them for. We'd all agreed to tell the cops that we got lost and were chased by some wild animals. I'm not sure they bought it, but they didn't press too hard either. After all, we were alive, and nobody goes poking into a story they don't want answers for. But here's the thing, I couldn't let it go. The laughter wouldn't stop. first, I thought it was in my head. You know how trauma gets inside you, replaying on a loop? I figured that was it. But then it started happening when I was wide awake. It always started the same. A low chuckle, faint and distant, like it was coming from outside the house. Then it would grow, crawling under my skin until I swore it was in the walls. In the shower. In the damn mirror. I stopped sleeping. I called Jake one night, desperate for someone to confirm I wasn't losing it. But when he answered, his voice sounded off. Flat, emotionless. You hear it too, right? I asked, pacing my tiny apartment. Every light turned on. There was a long pause. Then, in the calmest, most unnatural voice, he said, "You shouldn't have left the fire," and hung up. My blood went cold. I stared at the phone, willing myself to believe it was just some sick joke. But Jake wasn't like that. At least, not before. The next day, I drove to his place. His car was in the driveway, but when I knocked, no one answered. I peered through the window and saw the living room empty, the furniture untouched. It looked like he hadn't been there in days. That's when I realized I hadn't heard from Claire either. Panic started to set in. I called her, left a dozen messages, but nothing. Finally, I drove to her apartment. The door was slightly open, and when I pushed it, it swung inward with a long, eerie creak. "Claire," I called, stepping inside. The air was thick, like the place hadn't been ventilated in days. A strange smell hung in the air. Something metallic and damp. That's when I saw the marks. Long, claw-like scratches gouged into the walls and furniture, like something had been trying to dig its way out. "Claire!" I yelled, but the apartment was silent. In the middle of the living room, there was a notebook. It looked battered, the pages warped like it had been soaked in water. I flipped it open, my hands trembling. The handwriting was Claire's, scrawled and frantic. "They're still here. I hear them at night. Jake won't talk to me. I saw them in the hallway. They're inside now. I don't think I'm going to make it." The last page was smeared, the ink bleeding into a shaky message. "Don't follow the laughter." I bolted out of there, my heart hammering in my chest. That night, I locked every door and window, double-checking them like a man possessed. I sat in the corner of my living room, gripping a knife I knew wouldn't do a damn thing. But it was all I had. The laughter started around midnight. This time it was louder, closer. It echoed through the apartment, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The lights flickered, and for a moment, the air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on my chest. Then I saw them. In the corner of the room, just outside the reach of the lamp, their twisted forms crouched in the shadows. Too many eyes, too many teeth. Watching. One of them stepped forward, its grotesque grin widening. "You shouldn't have left the fire," it rasped. The lights went out. The next thing I remember, I was waking up in my car, parked on the side of the road miles away from my apartment. My clothes were damp, my hands caked with dirt. I don't know how I got there, but when I drove back to my place, it was empty. No scratches, no damage, no sign they'd ever been there. But they were. I moved across the country the next day, and now I keep the lights on at night. I never go near the woods, and when I hear that faint, wheezing laughter in the distance, I remind myself, don't follow the laughter. It's been 3 years since that night in Blackstone Woods. I live in a crowded city now, far from any forest, and I've done everything I can to forget. Therapy, meditation, even prescription pills. But none of it helps because the truth is, I'll never really escape what happened. Jake and Claire were never found. I reported them missing, but after weeks of fruitless searches, the authorities gave up. I didn't tell them about the creatures or the laughter. I didn't tell them about the notebook. I knew they wouldn't believe me. Hell, I barely believe me. But they're not gone. Not really. The laughter still finds me. It's rare. Once every few months if I'm lucky. But when it does, it's like being transported back to that night. The same guttural cackling, the same twisting, wheezing mockery. And every time it happens, I feel their eyes on me, watching from the shadows just outside my vision. A few nights ago, I woke up to the sound of my closet door creaking open. My heart dropped into my stomach as I sat up, clutching the baseball bat I keep next to my bed. The laughter came, soft at first, then louder, filling the room like a wave. I swung the bat wildly, screaming into the dark. But the laughter didn't stop. It just moved. Around me, through me. When I turned on the light, the room was empty. But on the closet door, carved deep into the wood, were 4 words. You shouldn't have left. I'm writing this now because I need someone, anyone, to know the truth. If you're reading this, stay away from Blackstone Woods. Don't go camping. Don't let the fire die. And if you ever hear laughter, no matter how faint or distant, don't follow it.